Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. We're going to begin today with the world lead. Today, President Trump continued his historic visit to the Middle East, touching down in Israel and meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, becoming the first sitting U.S. president to ever visit the holiest site in the Jewish faith, the Western Wall. At about the same time as that visit, we learned that fired National Security Advisor Michael Flynn plans to plead the Fifth and will not testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee. That was big news. So, of course, the president is focused on his swing through the Middle East. That began in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where the president disturbed even some in his own party by suggesting in his speech that he would not, quote, lecture countries on how to live, which many took as an abdication of the traditional role of the United States in publicly preaching the values of freedom and democracy, values that some critics suggest the Trump administration might not fully appreciate. Case in point, a source close to former FBI Director James Comey told me today that in Comey's February 14th Oval Office meeting with President Trump, the president expressed irritation with news stories about private phone conversations he had had with the leaders of Mexico and Australia, the president telling Comey that he needed to pursue the leakers. Comey tried to explain to the president that leak investigations are quite difficult for law enforcement because often you end up having to threaten to jail journalists. The president told Comey he should throw journalists in jail. This, the source said, is recorded in that memo composed contemporaneously by Comey about that meeting, as first reported by the New York Times. Another example of these values, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, a man who, as America's top representative to the world, is supposed to publicly demonstrate the importance of free speech and a free press. Tillerson held a news conference Sunday in Riyadh without alerting any American reporters that he was doing so. Not exactly leading by example on the virtues of freedom of the press. But it was Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross whose analysis of his time in Saudi Arabia truly stunned observers.
There's no question that they're liberalizing their society. And I think the other thing that was fascinating to me, there was not a single hint of a protester anywhere there during the whole time we were there. Not one guy with a bad placard.
Now, the anchor pointed out that Saudis don't have the same rights of free speech or free assembly that we have in the U.S., to which Secretary Ross replied this.
In theory, that could be true, but boy, there was certainly no sign of it.
It's not theory. In the wake of the Arab Spring in 2011, the Saudi Ministry of the Interior informed the Saudi people, quote, regulations in the kingdom forbid categorically all sorts of demonstrations, marches, and sit-ins as they contradict Islamic Sharia law and the values and traditions of Saudi society, unquote. Dissent in Saudi Arabia has been criminalized. Amnesty International this year noted that, quote, human rights activists in Saudi Arabia are an endangered species. One by one, they are vanishing, prosecuted, jailed, intimidated into silence, or forced into exile, highlighting the authorities' zero-tolerance approach to freedom of expression, unquote. But Ross noted that at the end of his trip, a number of Saudi security guards asked for a photograph with him.
And then they gave me 2 gigantic bushels of dates as a present, a thank you for the trip that we had had. That was a pretty from-the-heart, very genuine gesture.
2 gigantic bushels of dates? That's all it took for the Saudis to cover up an abysmal human rights record, funding for extremism all over the globe, evidence of possible government participation in 9/11, and current alleged war crimes against civilians in Yemen? A critic might say you guys are cheap dates. Pardon the pun. CNN senior White House correspondent Jim Acosta is traveling with the president in Jerusalem. And Jim, today the president seemed to perhaps inadvertently confirm that story that sources say he shared intelligence with the Russians.
That's right, Jake. And the White House is hoping the president can change the narrative back home by showing off the alliances he's building with leaders here in the Middle East. But the president finds new ways to step on his own message. He did that today when he tried to offer up an explanation for his sharing of Israeli intelligence with the Russians that didn't add up. Well, I think President Trump is discovering it's not so simple to bring the art of the deal to the Holy Land. After suggesting Middle East peace might be easy just weeks ago, the president acknowledged what his predecessors have known for decades. It's not.
I've heard it's one of the toughest deals of all, but I have a feeling that we're going to get there eventually. I hope.
Even as Mr. Trump continued this photo op-rich foreign trip by becoming the first sitting U.S. president to visit one of Judaism's holiest sites, the Western Wall, he is doing damage control with his Israeli hosts. The president appeared to confirm that he had recently shared classified Israeli intelligence with top-level Russian officials with this misleading explanation.
I never mentioned the word or the name Israel. Never mentioned it during that conversation. They were all saying I did. So you had to know the story wrong. Never mentioned the word Israel.
The problem is those news reports never stated the president mentioned Israel by name in that meeting with the Russians. While some in the administration insist there's no need for apologies,
I don't know that there's anything to apologize for.
Others are conceding some reassurances may be helpful.
We're trying to reassure all of our counterparts that what they tell us is kept, trusted, and valued, and we will return the favor.
But the president and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are both touting their strong ties with sharp criticism of the Iran nuclear deal that was crafted by the Obama administration.
But it was a terrible thing for the United States to enter that deal. And believe me, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, that I can tell you.
Still, the president has yet to follow through on his campaign promise to tear up the nuclear agreement.
I think that agreement is a disaster for this country, for Israel, for the Middle East.
And that's not the only contradiction from this trip. Contrast the president's rhetoric on Islam from the campaign trail.
I think Islam hates us.
With the softened language the president used in Saudi Arabia.
There is still much work to be done. That means honestly confronting the crisis of Islamic extremism and the Islamists and Islamic terror of all kinds.
The president slipped and said Islamic terror instead of Islamist terror, the White House said, because he is, quote, exhausted. But top administration officials who danced the night away with the Saudis are stepping around that comment.
He's doing better than I am, and he's got a few years on me.
And the president will find that the bargaining will only get tougher when he sits down with the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, tomorrow. Abbas obviously will have to be a partner in any peace talks. And while the president will have his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, at his side as he enters these talks, two of his top officials have already returned back to the White House. Jake, Chief of Staff Reince Priebus and his chief strategist, Steve Bannon, are already back at the White House. Jake?
All right, Jim Acosta live for us in Jerusalem. Thanks so much. With President Trump over